The night shift at Mercy General in Houston runs on silence and fluorescent light, and Colonel Marcus Holloway noticed the tremor in her hands first. Not fear. Something else. The kind of tremor that comes after holding steady for so long that the body forgets how to relax. He watched from his recovery bed in the cardiac unit as she moved through the ICU at 2:24 a.m., her scrubs bearing the permanent wrinkles of a 12-hour shift, her name badge catching the pale glow of the monitors. Sarah Chen. He read it 3 times, his eyes narrowing, his fingers tracing the tattoo on his forearm without quite understanding why. The name Chen had been inked there for 9 years, block letters, no flourish, a debt that had never been paid in full. But her face remained a ghost to him, obscured by the fog of anesthesia and post-operative morphine that still clouded the edges of his vision. The monitors beside his bed beat their steady rhythm as she paused outside his room, checking the 4-line visible through the window. She didn't acknowledge his gaze. She never did. 3 months prior, Sarah had walked through those same doors carrying a single piece of luggage and a carefully constructed identity that began and ended with a name on her hospital badge. The personnel file at Mercy General noted her hire date in June, her credentials impeccable, her references solid. What it did not contain, could not contain, were the redacted sections, the classified annotations, the single line in block capitals that read, employment history prior to medical reassignment officially denied. She had been given a choice that day in a nondescript office building in Arlington, disappear, or watch the entire operation in Helmand Province be buried under a congressional investigation. She had chosen disappear. The truth was buried either way. Her first weeks at Mercy General passed in the kind of invisibility that came from being competent and unremarkable in equal measure. She charted with the precision of someone who understood that documentation was a form of armor. Every vital sign recorded. Every medication dose verified twice. Every equipment replacement logged by part number and serial code. The senior nurses on the day shift began to notice that Sarah caught things other people missed, the subtle changes in a patient's breathing pattern that preceded sepsis by hours, the medication interactions that the computer algorithms flagged too late, the inconsistencies in supply orders that didn't quite add up. They mentioned it in passing. Mostly, they left her alone. The cardiac unit occupied the 3rd floor of Mercy General's East Tower, a 30-bed ICU where Colonel Holloway had arrived 6 weeks earlier via helicopter from Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls. Post-operative cardiac tamponade from a surgical bleed that had nearly cost him his life on the table. He had been intubated for 4 days, sedated, unconscious through the worst of it. When he finally surfaced into wakefulness, the tubes were gone and the room smelled of antiseptic and something underneath it, something like copper and electricity. The ventilator had left his throat raw. The morphine made his thoughts move like underwater currents. And somewhere in the haze of recovery, he had begun to notice the night shift nurse. She moved differently than the others. The residents came in loud, full of the confidence that belonged to people who had never seen their own mortality up close. The day nurses carried the fatigue of 12-hour battles with insurance companies and family members and patients who demanded more than medicine could give. But Sarah Chen moved as if the ICU were a minefield she had already mapped. No wasted motion. No sharp sounds. She checked the arterial line with the gentle precision of someone performing a ritual she understood in her bones. She adjusted the bed rails with movements so practiced they seemed to require no conscious thought. And every time she entered his room, Colonel Holloway found himself watching her hands, scarred across the knuckles, the palms marked with faint lines that looked almost like calluses from holding something heavy for too long. One night, watching her replace the dressing on his central line with a technique so efficient it took less than 90 seconds, he had tried to speak. His voice came out rough, fractured. "Where did you learn that?" She had paused, her gloved hands freezing for the briefest moment, and then continued her work without answering. When she left, she had pulled the door closed so softly he barely heard it click shut. The mystery of it stayed with him through the long hours of the night shift, through the beeping monitors and the occasional code blew down the corridor, through the way she never quite met his eyes. The locker room at Mercy General was a windowless space on the 3rd floor basement level, fluorescent lights casting everything in the tone of a photograph that had already faded. Sarah's locker was the smallest one, the metal door dented along the bottom edge from a decade of maintenance carts rolled past. Inside, folded on the top shelf behind her spare scrubs, was a pair of combat boots wrapped carefully in plastic. They had belonged to someone else once, a husband, maybe, or a brother. She didn't look at them often. Once every few weeks, she would open the locker, touch the plastic, and then close the door again. The boots had survived Helmand Province. The person who had worn them had not. By the third month of her employment, Sarah's meticulous charting had begun to paint a very specific picture of something wrong. It started as a small inconsistency in supply orders for the cardiac surgical unit, replacement equipment that didn't match the inventory system, quantities that exceeded anything reasonable for the cases performed. She had noticed it first in the charts of a routine bypass patient who had consumed nearly $30,000 in specialty equipment across a 2-day stay. Then another patient. Then 3 more in the span of a week. Each case marked with asterisks in the supply logs, each one flowing through what appeared to be a preferred vendor with a name she recognized from somewhere deep in the administrative structure. The discrepancies would have been nothing. Hospital systems were notoriously baroque, inventory tracked across multiple databases that rarely synchronized. Except that Sarah had spent years in military field hospitals where every inventory item mattered because supplies didn't arrive by truck, they arrived by helicopter, and helicopters were expensive and dangerous and didn't land often. She had learned to read a supply chain the way other people read faces. And what she was reading in Dr. Sterling's surgical cases was a pattern that looked almost like clockwork, almost like precision, almost like something that had been carefully constructed to look accidental. Dr. Sterling first appeared at morning rounds on a Tuesday in late August, his polished shoes announcing his arrival before his voice did. The shoes were Italian leather, probably custom, the kind of detail that revealed more about a man's priorities than any curriculum vitae could contain. He swept through the cardiac unit with the kind of confidence that belonged to someone who had never questioned whether he belonged in a room. The residents trailed behind him like remoras following a shark. He barely glanced at the patients, his attention fixed entirely on the monitors and the charts, his comments delivered in a tone that suggested he was annoyed with all of them, the patients for being sick, the nurses for being competent, the residents for existing at all. When he passed Sarah's station, she was updating the medication reconciliation for a post-MI patient. He didn't acknowledge her. She didn't look up. But in the cardiac wing of Mercy General, the night shift belonged to Sarah Chen. The day crews came and went, but at 10 p.m., when the visitors cleared out and the surgical lights dimmed, the ICU contracted into a different world. The monitors became background symphonies. The occasional code blue became not a disaster but a problem to solve. The patients, somehow, seemed smaller at night, less like complex medical cases and more like human beings who had temporarily lost the ability to do what their bodies were meant to do. Sarah worked through those hours with the focused intensity of someone who had long ago accepted that some things could only be fixed in the dark. She was updating charts at 11:56 p.m. when she noticed it, a discrepancy in the billing codes for the same preferred vendor, this time for equipment that had been flagged for a surgery 3 months ago. The patient had been a straightforward case, 30 minutes, minimal complication. Yet the supply charges listed included items that had no reasonable application to the procedure performed. She typed the patient name into the hospital system, cross-referenced the OR logs, and pulled up the actual equipment used. What had been billed? $42,000. What had been used? Approximately $7,000. The difference was not a rounding error. The difference was not a typo in the system. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the sound of electricity slowly burning out, that particular hospital noise that seemed to exist in the background of every late-night shift. Sarah printed the chart, then thought better of it and closed the browser window instead. Her hands, for just a moment, went still. Then she stood, checked on her patients, and continued her shift with the kind of mechanical precision that had kept her alive through worse problems than this. In room 314, Colonel Holloway watched her pass his window for the 7th time that night and wondered, with the clouded clarity of a man still half sedated, why she never seemed to sleep. Thursday morning at Mercy General arrived like every other morning, the smell of industrial bleach mixing with stale coffee, the fluorescent lights casting everything in a shade of institutional white. Sarah Chen had worked the night shift for 3 months. 3 months of invisible competence, of charts that read like poetry written in medical terminology, of hands that moved through the hospital's corridors with the kind of precision that came from having once moved through something far more dangerous. The cafeteria at 6:19 a.m. was the domain of the day-shift physicians. They clustered near the south windows where the light was best, their white coats unbuttoned, their voices carrying the tone of people who believed the hospital's architecture had been designed specifically to amplify their importance. Sarah entered with her tray, timing her passage to avoid interaction. She had learned this: move like water, leave no ripple, eat quickly, disappear. Dr. Sterling sat with 4 other attendings, his Italian leather shoes gleaming beneath the plastic table. He was a tall man built like a surgeon's ego, broad-shouldered, expensively maintained, the kind of handsome that came from a dermatologist's precision and confidence rooted in never being told no. His shoes were custom. His watch cost more than Sarah's car. His hands had never held a life together in a makeshift field hospital. She was 3 steps past his chair when his right foot extended. The tray hit tile with a sound like artillery. The sandwich, turkey and mustard on wheat, packed the night before in her studio apartment, exploded across the floor in a spray of crumbs and yellow. The apple rolled to the wall. The yogurt container cracked. The orange juice puddled around her shoes like spilled blood. Every conversation stopped. Sterling leaned back in his chair with the posture of someone observing an interesting experiment. "Pick that up, sweetheart. Night shift nurses shouldn't eat with the medical staff anyway." The other attendings did not look at her. They studied their coffee. One adjusted his stethoscope. Another opened his phone. The silence had weight. The silence had judgment. Sarah stood motionless for 1 breath. 2. Her hands were steady. Her vision had narrowed to Sterling's face, the tilt of his chin, the confidence settling into the corners of his mouth like a predator recognizing prey that had already surrendered. A single tear escaped from her left eye. Just one. She wiped it without breaking eye contact, her jaw moving only slightly as she spoke. "I've cleaned up worse messes than this, Doctor. Some of them even survived." Sterling's smile froze. She knelt and began gathering the debris. The turkey. The broken container. The apple. The other physicians still did not look at her, which was worse than if they had. She could feel Sterling's eyes on the back of her head as she rose, the ruined lunch balanced in her palms. When she turned toward the trash, she caught her reflection in the stainless steel counter, a woman in blue scrubs, hair pulled back so tightly it pulled at the corners of her eyes, hands moving with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned long ago that composure was the only weapon that never jammed. That afternoon, the staff meeting that had been scheduled for weeks took on a different tenor. Sterling arrived with Sarah's patient charts, 3 weeks of meticulous documentation, every vital sign recorded, every medication reconciled, every notation written in her surgical penmanship that left 0 room for error. He did not sit. He stood at the head of the conference table and scattered the charts like playing cards, pages floating and landing across the surface with the careless precision of someone demonstrating dominance. "I want to make something public," he announced. His voice had the texture of commitment. "I'm placing a wager with any taker in this room. This nurse quits within 1 week. Who wants the other side of that bet?" 23 people occupied the conference room. 23 people who saw Sarah standing against the back wall. 23 people who did not raise their hands. The silence stretched. Someone coughed. Sterling smiled wider, and then he walked past her chair, and as he passed, he leaned down just enough that only she could hear. "Your protocols are outdated military nonsense, and you're making the real medical professionals look bad." The words were meant to land. They did. But they landed on composure, not on skin. After the meeting, Sterling made 4 phone calls. The first was to board Chairman Mitchell, the kind of call that happened between golf partners who understood certain conversations required discretion and deniability. "We have a night shift nurse," Sterling explained, charting obsessively, questioning decisions, creating a hostile environment with her judgment. "I'm concerned about patient safety and staff morale." Thought you should know. The second was to the state nursing board, called from his car, delivered through an anonymous voicemail service. I'm concerned about a nurse at Mercy General who may be practicing beyond her scope of practice. There are gaps in her employment history and questions about her stability. You should investigate. The third was to Sarah's 3 listed references, the professors from her nursing degree who had not heard her voice in 12 years. He called each one, his tone confident but concerned. Just gathering information for a reference check, he said. I'm noticing some gaps in her employment history. Can you speak to her stability? Has she ever mentioned mental health issues? What was the reason she left clinical practice for so long? The fourth was to his medical supply vendor, Rodriguez, who understood that their arrangement, the one that netted Sterling $42,000 monthly in kickbacks for steering surgical cases toward overpriced equipment, required protection. Rodriguez texted first, "She's a problem. Handle it." Sterling replied, "She'll be gone by Monday." The confidence in that text message was the kind that came from having spent 15 years in a system that never pushed back. The kind that came from having never once been told no by anyone who had the authority to make it stick. Sarah sat in her car in the Mercy General parking lot, her hands gripping the steering wheel at the 2 and 10 o'clock positions the way she had been taught decades ago in another place, another life. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear, or fear was a luxury she had learned to recognize and compartmentalize before most people her age understood what anxiety even meant. The trembling was something else. It was the physical manifestation of rage compressed into composure so tight it manifested as vibration at the cellular level. She could see Sterling through the hospital windows, moving through the corridor with the gait of someone who believed gravity itself bent toward his convenience. He was making calls. She knew this because she had been invisible in rooms with men like him before, in places where the walls were sandstone instead of drywall, and she knew the cadence of predators coordinating a kill. Her phone buzzed. An email from Human Resources, marked urgent, preliminary meeting scheduled for Friday 9 a.m. Purpose: discussion regarding patient care protocols and scope of practice concerns. Please confirm your attendance. She confirmed. Then she sat in silence and watched the parking lot fill with day-shift vehicles, watched the city of Houston wake around her, watched the sun climb higher over Mercy General's glass facade, and thought of a patient in room 314 who was about to need more than compassion. He was going to need someone willing to break every rule that had been written to protect people exactly like Dr. Sterling. Friday morning arrived like every other morning, fluorescent lights buzzing their mechanical prayer, the hospital corridor stretching out in shades of beige and antiseptic. Sarah Chen sat across from the HR director in a room that smelled like stale coffee and the particular flavor of institutional betrayal. The preliminary investigation was scheduled. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a timeline, and she was watching it tick down like a bomb everyone pretended not to see. Dr. Sterling has filed a formal complaint, the HR director said, not meeting her eyes. Regarding billing documentation you flagged. He says you've been making errors. Sarah didn't blink. Didn't shift in her chair. The way she sat, spine straight, hands folded in her lap, looked like compliance. It was actually a tactical posture. Small target. Zero threat assessment. She'd learned it in a place where mistakes in posture meant a sniper painted your center mass. I documented everything accurately, Sarah said. There will be a full audit. Of your charts. Your procedures. Everything from the past 3 months. The director finally looked up, seeking a reaction. She found none. Do you understand the severity? Sarah understood more than the director could possibly know. She understood that Dr. Sterling had just accelerated his timetable. He wasn't just trying to discredit her findings anymore, he was trying to bury her. The medical supply kickback arrangement was worth too much to let her keep asking questions. She'd seen the pattern in his surgical documentation. 7 cases. Unnecessary equipment charges. Phantom consultations. Approximately $240,000 diverted across 3 months. She left the office at 6:16 a.m. Report time was 7:02 p.m. The day stretched between them like a gulf. By the time she clocked in at Mercy General that evening, the cloud had already settled over her. She could feel it in the way the charge nurse didn't make eye contact, in the way the attending surgeon moved past her desk without his usual nod. The board investigation was no secret. Sterling had been thorough about spreading the news. One phone call to board member Harrison. Another to Chief of Surgery Mitchell. By noon, every senior staff member knew that Sarah Chen's documentation was under review for discrepancies. Not one of them knew what the discrepancies actually were. The colonel was awake when she entered his room at 7:15 p.m. 3 days post-op cardiac surgery, still pale, still tethered to monitors that beeped their steady reassurance. The tattoo on his forearm, her name, inked there the day she dragged him across a kill zone in Helmand Province while rounds punched through the air around them, was partially hidden by the fall line. He studied her face each time she entered. She could see the recognition trying to form. The memory struggling against anesthesia and pain medication. She always looked away first. Tonight, something was different. His breathing had changed. Subtle. The kind of change most people wouldn't notice. But Sarah had spent 3 years in field medicine before becoming a nurse. She'd learned to read the body like text. Respiratory rate elevated. 32. Normal was 16. His neck veins were distended. The jugular venous pulsation climbed toward his jaw. The monitors showed a blood pressure beginning to drift down. 98 systolic. Falling. Muffled heart sounds. Sarah moved to his bedside and placed her stethoscope against his chest. The heart sounds were distant. Like someone calling from the other side of a wall. Post-surgical bleeding into the pericardial sac. Cardiac tamponade. The fluid building around his heart was crushing it like a fist. His body was suffocating itself from the inside. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice level. "Hard to breathe." His voice was thin. "Chest feels heavy." She was already moving. Checking the on-call surgeon's number. Paging overhead, "Dr. Richardson, call ICU, stat." "Dr. Richardson, ICU stat." She grabbed the bedside ultrasound probe, the portable unit kept in every ICU for exactly these moments. The screen bloomed with grey and black imagery. There. The fluid collection. Anterior and posterior to the right ventricle. Approximately 200 milliliters. Maybe more. 50 milliliters could stop a heart. The page went out again. And again. Dr. Richardson didn't answer. The colonel's oxygen saturation was dropping. 94%. 92. His blood pressure fell to 86. The monitors began to sing their distress melody. Faster beeps. Staccato now. Urgent. There was no surgeon. There was only this moment and what happened next. Sarah didn't think about licenses or scope of practice or what Dr. Sterling would say. Those were concepts that belonged to a world where people had time. The colonel didn't have time. The pericardiocentesis was the only intervention that worked in the next 7 minutes. 8, if she was lucky. After that, his heart would fail from compression. The fluid had to come out. The pressure had to release. She moved like muscle memory was breathing for her. 2 minutes to set up. Sterile field on his chest. The skin prepped with antiseptic that smelled like hospitals everywhere, the hospital in Houston, the field hospital in San Juan Valley. The sensation was identical. The stakes were identical. Only the uniform had changed. The needle was a 14-gauge angiocath, 18 centimeters long. She found the 5th intercostal space, midclavicular line. The anatomical landmarks were cartography she'd memorized years ago. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this under fire. Under rain. Under rounds that cut the air like invisible razors. The needle went in. The membrane yielded. The pericardium gave way. And then, the hiss of air as fluid rushed out through the catheter. Dark fluid. Arterial blood. The fluid that was crushing his heart. The monitors changed their song immediately. The heart rate stabilized. The oxygen saturation climbed. 94. 96. 98. The blood pressure began to recover. 88. 90. The sound of his heartbeat through the stethoscope shifted from muffled to distinct. The beautiful rhythm of a heart remembering how to work. 70 seconds. That was all it took. She was attaching the stopcock valve when the door exploded open. Dr. Sterling. 2 security guards flanking him like bodyguards. His face had transformed into something that looked like victory, except it was really desperation trying to wear a mask. "Step away from that patient immediately," Sterling said. His voice was the sound of someone used to giving orders and having them obeyed. "You just practice medicine without a license. That's a felony." Sarah removed her gloves with the kind of deliberate calm that made seconds stretch into geological ages. She didn't hurry. She didn't rush. She placed them in the biohazard container like she had all the time in the world. Like security guards weren't already moving toward her. Like her career wasn't already being crushed under the weight of what she'd just done. That's when the captain stepped forward. Captain Jessica Morrison was lean and sharp-eyed, uniform pressed with the kind of discipline that comes from military service. She moved between the guards and Sarah with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This woman just saved my father's life," she said. Her voice was quiet. Controlled. The voice of command. While your surgeon was apparently unavailable. Sterling's eyes didn't move from Sarah. The recognition was beginning. Some part of him was starting to understand that she wasn't actually just a nurse. But he was committed now. He'd already texted Board Chairman Mitchell, already triggered the legal machinery. "Escort her out," he ordered the guards. "I'm calling the police." Assault with a deadly weapon. That needle. The colonel's oxygen monitor continued its steady beep. Sinus rhythm restored. The vital signs climbing back toward normal. The evidence written in real time across the screens. Sarah moved toward the door with the guards, but the captain followed, her phone already in her hand. "The ultrasound images are time-stamped," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "The paging records are documented. Your surgeon was unavailable for 17 minutes. Standard of care required intervention." She was already photographing the bedside documentation. And everyone in this hospital just witnessed what happened. Sterling's confidence fractured slightly, but he recovered it quickly. He was already turning toward the monitor, already dismissing what the machine was telling him. By the time the night surgeon finally arrived, Dr. Chen, no relation, who'd been in the operating room finishing a transplant, it took him exactly 40 seconds to review the ultrasound images and the procedure notes. "Textbook pericardiocentesis," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly what he was witnessing. "If she hadn't done this, we'd be doing open cardiac massage in 5 minutes." But Sterling was already moving. Already activated. He personally escorted Sarah to her locker in the physician's lounge. Watched her remove the pair of worn combat boots from the bottom of the metal cabinet. The boots that had carried her through Helmand Province. The boots that had walked through 3 months of invisibility at Mercy General. The boots that were about to disappear from her professional life. "You should have just picked up the tray, sweetheart," he said. The smile on his face was the smile of someone who believed he still held all the cards. But that wasn't the worst part. By dawn, the hospital attorney had filed termination paperwork. The board had scheduled an emergency investigative meeting. An outside medical auditor, recommended personally by Dr. Sterling, had been hired to review every chart Sarah had touched in the past 3 months. Her nursing references, those poor souls who'd written glowing letters about her work ethic, were receiving phone calls from the auditor asking careful questions about patterns of exceeding scope of practice. The colonel, stable now, with a catheter draining the fluid around his heart, asked his daughter a question as she sat in the chair beside his bed. "Who was that nurse?" he asked. Captain Morrison looked at the procedure documentation. The documentation that would later be officially attributed to Dr. Chen, the night surgeon who arrived too late to do anything except verify what had already been done. Sarah's name hadn't made it into the official record. Sterling had been thorough about that too. "I don't know," the captain said. "But she was already reaching for her phone. But I'm going to find out." Security escorted her from Mercy General at 4:02 p.m. No badge. No final paycheck. Just a cardboard box containing 3 months of invisibility, stethoscope, trauma shears, the laminated hospital ID that had labeled her as competent but dispensable. The termination letter had been printed on cream-colored paper in Sterling's preferred font, each word a surgical incision: gross misconduct, immediate revocation of privileges, referral to the State Board for license suspension pending investigation. She didn't cry in the parking lot. Didn't cry in the car. The trembling wasn't weakness, it was restraint, the kind that comes from people trained to keep moving even when the world is collapsing behind them. Rain had started before she reached Memorial Garden Cemetery on the far side of Houston, the kind of rain that fell like applause on the hood of her sedan, steady and relentless. The headstone was simple. Granite. No flourish. Just the facts, which had always been enough for her: Lieutenant Marcus Chen, United States Army, beloved husband. The dates below: born 1988, died 2021, still managed to steal something from her chest every time she stood here. She clutched the boots to her body like they might dissolve in the rain. These were the boots she'd worn in Helmand Province. The ones that had walked through Sanjin Valley carrying men who were supposed to die but didn't, because her hands knew exactly what to do and her mind refused to accept failure as an option. The soles were worn through in places. The laces were frayed. One heel had been scuffed by shrapnel from an IED blast that had killed the platoon's radio operator 30 feet to her left. She'd never cleaned the scuff marks away. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the rain and the stone and the husband beneath it. "I tried to stay invisible like they ordered, and I failed anyway." The military had been clear in the redacted briefing room at Walter Reed: Operation Buried Shadow was being erased. Not archived. Erased. Her deployment records would be classified above top secret. Her service record would be struck. Her commendations would be locked in a vault that officially didn't exist. She was to assume a civilian identity, disappear into the general population, speak to no one about what she'd done or where she'd done it. The ceremony acknowledging her medals would not happen. The witness statements would not exist. The 17 men she'd carried to safety on her back, literally, some of them, their blood soaking through her uniform while she moved like a ghost through enemy fire, would never be allowed to say her name in public. "They told me to disappear after Helmand," she continued, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "That my records were erased, that I didn't exist anymore. I got a job, kept my head down. I just wanted to be nobody. I wanted to be safe. And I still couldn't make it work." The rain hammered harder. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed toward the highway, emergency lights cutting through the storm like someone else's crisis. Always someone else's. That had been the deal. She'd traded the weight of 17 lives saved for the invisibility of a single unremarkable nurse. She'd taken the pericardiocentesis training, the 4 protocols, the hospital certifications. She'd learned to move through a civilian ICU the way she'd learned to move through a field hospital, with precision and speed and the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst. Then the colonel had crashed, his chest filling with blood, and her hands had taken over. She set the boots at the grave's base, heels pointing outward like a soldier standing watch. The leather was already soaked, rain pooling around them. Inside one boot, folded into the toe, was a DD-214 discharge form with entire sections redacted in black marker, thick lines obscuring the unit designation, the operational theater, the cause of discharge. Also in that folder at home, locked in a box beneath her mattress, a phone number for a DOD office that officially didn't exist. A classified citation she'd been ordered to never speak of. A photo of 17 men standing in front of a Chinook helicopter, all of them alive because she'd refused to let them be anything else. She didn't call the number. That was the rule. Calling meant the operation was no longer buried. Calling meant exposing not just herself but the men she'd carried, their families, the national security apparatus that had deemed her sacrifice necessary and her silence essential. The formal termination papers had arrived by courier at 6:13 p.m. Sterling had been methodical, the kind of methodical that only comes from institutional power and careful planning. The board investigation included written testimony from 3 physicians vouching for his character while simultaneously condemning hers. An auditor had found irregularities in her documentation, the meticulous charting that had exposed his billing inflation, the careful notation of supply costs that contradicted his invoices, the paper trail she'd been creating without even knowing it was damning him. An anonymous complaint had been filed with the state nursing board alleging she'd misrepresented her qualifications, that her experience exceeded her credentials, that she'd overstepped her scope of practice in ways that suggested either dangerous arrogance or dangerous training outside normal hospital settings. The complaint was detailed enough to be credible. It was also clever enough that nobody would ever be able to prove Sterling had written it. She was suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. Pending termination was the phrase they used, though everyone understood termination was already decided. Sterling had simply constructed the scaffolding to make it appear inevitable, judicial, deserved. Her apartment was small and bare, a rental furnished with the kind of generic furniture that left no impression. 3 months of careful invisibility had accumulated into almost nothing. She opened a locked box, the one under her mattress, the one she hadn't opened in almost 3 years, and stared at the contents as if they might rearrange themselves into a different story. DD 214 form, military discharge certificate. Sections blacked out. Entire narrative removed. Just her name remaining, Chen, Sarah M., rank, E8, Senior Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy, honorable discharge. Below that, a citation typed on official letterhead, for extraordinary valor under fire in hostile territory, combat medic operations, life-saving emergency medical intervention in direct fire situation. The rest was redacted. 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 Page after page of black marker obscuring the details of what she'd actually done. Phone number for a .office. No name. No address. Just the digits and a note in faded handwriting, if you need extraction, call this number. After 48 hours, don't call again. It had been 1,047 days since she'd left Helmand Province. She was not calling. That night, federal vehicles arrived at Mercy General. 2 black SUVs, armored. A courier briefcase. An ICU room cleared and secured with 2 armed federal agents positioned at the door. Sarah didn't know this yet. She was at home, holding cold coffee, staring at a box of boots and redacted papers. The new patient arrived at 6:44 a.m. on Tuesday morning, wheeled through the emergency department under escort. Guards at both ends of the stretcher. Federal badges visible. The intake paperwork was marked in red, high-value asset, protection detail required, clearance level above top secret. The man on the stretcher was 43 years old, Pashto speaking, a former Taliban commander now seeking political asylum in exchange for intelligence cooperation. His kidneys were failing. His right eye socket held a prosthetic. The scars on his neck told stories nobody would ever be allowed to confirm. Sarah returned to Mercy General at 8:15 a.m. to collect her final paycheck and clear her locker. The hospital had already changed her badge access. Her shift schedule had been deleted. Her name was no longer on any surgical roster. It was as if she'd evaporated overnight, leaving only paperwork behind. She moved through the corridors that had been her territory for 3 months, trying to exist as a ghost in the building where she'd just saved a man's life. The hallway smelled like it always did, antiseptic overlaid with stale coffee and the faint chemical tang of industrial floor cleaner. She was carrying the cardboard box, trying to move without being seen, when she heard the screaming. Pashto. A voice filled with terror and recognition, each word articulated like a wound opening. The sound came from the ICU, from the secured room at the far end of the ward where federal agents had stationed themselves outside the door. She froze. Everyone froze. The screaming continued, a single word repeated over and over, a word she understood from field hospital work, from a tour that officially never happened, Janji. Warrior. 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 She kept moving. Kept the box in her hands. Kept her face forward and her breathing even and her hands from trembling, which they weren't doing. Not from fear. From something else. Something that made the fluorescent lights overhead seem too bright, too sharp, too present. The ICU nurse station erupted into quiet emergency, radios crackling, federal agents speaking into phones, the medical team trying to understand why the new patient was in acute psychological distress. Sarah set her box down at her old locker, opened the door, and began removing the few personal items she'd accumulated, a spare stethoscope, trauma shears, the photograph she'd kept of Marcus in his Class A uniform. Senior Chief. The voice came from behind her, young and authoritative and certain of the answer before the question was asked. She turned. Army uniform. Captain's rank. Eyes that looked like they belonged to someone who'd spent time around military culture, around the weight of knowing exactly who was standing in front of you. The captain studied her face with the kind of recognition that only military people carry, the ability to see rank and service in the small scars, the calluses on hands, the way someone stood when they thought nobody was watching. Senior Chief Petty Officer, the captain said again, not asking this time. Confirming. Acknowledging. Stating fact as a form of respect. The box fell. Sarah's hands, the ones that had been steady through a pericardiocentesis 3 days ago, the ones that had carried men through kill zones, the ones that had been trained to function perfectly under conditions that would break normal people, began to tremor. Not from fear. From recognition. From the moment when invisibility ended and the world suddenly remembered what she was. 3 days. That's how long it took for the next patient to walk through Mercy General's emergency doors and change everything Sarah had survived for. The ICU admission came through at 2:33 a.m. on a Tuesday. Male, 53, former Taliban military commander seeking asylum in the United States. Acute kidney injury. Sepsis. The kind of patient that made the staff murmur and glance at each other, not out of medical concern, but out of something older. Something that lived in the space between nations. Sarah was prepping the dialysis machine when he arrived. The hiss of tubing, the beep of pump calibration, her hands moving through the setup with the muscle memory of someone who had done this in field hospitals where the walls were canvas and the artillery sounded like thunder. The patient came in restrained on the stretcher, fever-bright and thrashing. She didn't look up. She never looked up. The man's eyes found her face and something broke open in his chest like shattered glass. He screamed. Not words at first, just sound, raw and animal, the kind of sound that made the ventilators seem quiet by comparison. Then the words came. Pashtu, rapid fire, his voice cracking like a boy's voice, pointing at her with a hand trembling so violently the fall line nearly tore free. He screamed the same word again and again. Ghazi! 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 The room went dead silent. Every veteran on the ward turned their heads. The surgical tech who'd served 18 months in Kandahar. The respiratory therapist with a Purple Heart in his locker. The phlebotomist who'd walked FOB Shank for a deployment. They all turned. They all looked. They all understood. Colonel Morrison's daughter, Captain Sarah Morrison, United States Army, was making rounds in the ICU when it happened. She was in the doorway. She heard the screaming. She saw the recognition in the prisoner's face. And she saw Sarah Chen standing perfectly still beside the dialysis machine, her hand steady on the tubing, her jaw clenched into a line like carved granite. The captain stepped forward, moving with the precision of someone trained in protocol and authority. She looked at Sarah for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, quietly enough that only the staff could hear, Senior Chief Petty Officer. Not a greeting. A confirmation. The FBI agent arrived 20 minutes later. Not local field office, this was federal task force level. Agent Kowalski, 40 years old, carrying a classified folder the color of rust. He found Sarah in the break room pouring coffee that she didn't drink, moving through the motions of normalcy the way soldiers do when the world has just shifted on its axis. Senior Chief Chen. It wasn't a question. She turned. One measured breath. Agent Kowalski. He opened the folder. 3 pages. Commendations on Official Department of Defense letterhead, the kind of document that didn't officially exist until it did. The words seemed to glow on the paper like they'd been written in something other than ink. Navy Cross. 1 line. She didn't move. 2 silver stars. 1 line each. Her coffee went cold in her hands. Purple heart with 3 clusters. 1 line for each wound. 1 line for each time her blood had watered the soil of Helmand Province. You pulled 17 men out of a kill zone, Kowalski said, reading from the citation, when their assigned medical officer became a casualty. Under sustained fire. Returning 3 times for wounded personnel despite catastrophic ammunition expenditure by hostile forces. Your actions resulted in the survival of all 17 service members and the recovery of your wounded medic. He looked up. That's not the official reason you're here. But it's why I came personally. The next voice came from the ICU observation window. A man in dress blues, ribbons on his chest like medals from a war that would never end. Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Holloway, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. The man who'd called Sarah Angel 6 in radio chatter when bullets were screaming like locusts and men were falling like rain. I visited the colonel, Holloway said, stepping into the break room. His voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, heavy, controlled, dangerous if provoked. He's fully alert now. Cardiac rhythm stable. No complications from the tamponade repair. He paused. He asked me 3 times if the night shift nurse was still here. Same nurse who kept talking to him, telling him to stay awake. Sarah's hands trembled. Not fear. Restraint. He got your name tattooed, Holloway continued, and his voice cracked slightly, the only sign that what he was about to say cost him something. The day you carried him to the medevac bird under fire. Got it right here. He tapped his forearm. Chen. Because you wouldn't let him die. Because you came back for him twice more when protocol said to leave him. The break room was so quiet you could hear the ice maker humming in the corner like a small mechanical heartbeat. They told him you died in a second attack. Holloway's eyes weren't wet. Warrior's eyes didn't do wet, but something had changed behind them. They gave him a folded flag at Arlington. Ceremony and everything. He carried that guilt for 8 years. That's why when you walked into his hospital room and he saw your face, he couldn't place it. The woman he remembered was supposed to be dead. Sarah set down the coffee cup. It hit the counter without a sound. Before anyone could speak, the ICU alarms went off. Not a panic alarm, a protocol alert. The Taliban commander's potassium had spiked. The dialysis needed to start immediately or his heart would arrest before the afternoon staff shift. Sarah moved without hesitation. Past Kowalski. Past Holloway. Past the weight of 8 years of classified silence. Her hands moved on muscle memory older than grief, older than erasure. She connected the vascular access, primed the dialysate line, entered the treatment parameters into the machine. The hiss of tubing connecting. The beep of pump calibration. Everything exactly as it should be. The prisoner watched her work. His eyes had cleared slightly, sepsis still burning behind them, but clarity there too. Recognition. Fear. Something that might have been respect. You saved him, Sarah said quietly, checking the blood flow rate. When your men hit the patrol. You carried that wounded interpreter back to your compound instead of executing him. I found medical supplies in your field hospital after we detained you. She met his eyes. That makes you a man, not a ghost. You'll get dialysis. You'll get antibiotics. You'll get asylum if your testimony helps. She paused. And you'll remember that today, a warrior saved your life. Not because you were her enemy. Because she was her father's daughter. She didn't wait for a response. The security footage arrived 16 minutes later. James Park, IT administrator and Marine Corps veteran, walked into the ICU with a laptop under his arm like he was carrying classified intelligence, which, in a way, he was. He looked at Sarah once. No words. Just a nod that said, "I've got your back." Sterling accessed the hospital security system, Park said, opening the file for Agent Kowalski. The footage played on the screen in grayscale. A man in a white coat. A tray hitting the floor. A foot extending deliberately. The sandwich crushed under polished leather. Friday morning, 6:23 a.m., using his administrative credentials. The next clip. The staff meeting. Chart papers flying like confetti. "I'm going to watch her quit." Sterling's voice, confident, certain of his power. The final clip. The colonel's room. A medication vial switched. And 4-bag repositioned. Sterling's hand on the monitor, changing the alarm settings so the staff wouldn't be alerted to the dropping oxygen saturation. He was trying to let the colonel die, Park said quietly. In case Sarah tried to take credit for saving him. Dead patients can't testify to a nurse's heroism. Agent Kowalski's jaw tightened. Evidence of attempted deletion. Timestamps, Park said. He handed over a flash drive the size of a thumbnail. "I preserve every frame on a separate server. When the deletion flags hit the system logs, I filed a federal complaint with the Healthcare Fraud Task Force." He exhaled. "I also pulled billing records cross-referenced with supply orders." Dr. Sterling ordered equipment from Medisupply Solutions at 3 times market rate. His personal account shows monthly deposits from their parent company. Roughly $47,000 per month over 3 years. The math was simple. 56 months. Over $2.5 million. One man's stolen future. "I'm placing him under arrest," Kowalski said. He turned to 2 federal agents waiting by the ICU entrance. "Read him his rights." They found Sterling in his office. He was already packing. His hands were shaking as he stuffed papers into his briefcase like a man trying to stuff down the truth. When he saw the federal agents, his face went the color of old bone. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sterling said. His voice had changed. No more arrogance. Just fear wearing a suit. "You accessed the hospital security system and attempted to delete footage documenting your fraud and attempted criminal negligence," Agent Kowalski said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You also attempted to interfere with patient care to protect evidence of your crimes." Sterling's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again like a fish in the wrong kind of water. "My colleague has preserved all footage," Park said. He stepped forward, and his Marine Corps bearing was suddenly visible, not the hospital IT guy anymore, but a warrior in a different uniform. "The evidence is already in federal custody. Deleting your files was a federal crime on top of the healthcare fraud." The state medical board representative arrived with board chairman Mitchell. Mitchell's face was the kind of gray that comes from realizing you've been fooled by someone you trusted. He looked at Sterling like Sterling was a stranger. He probably was. "Your medical license is suspended immediately pending investigation," the board representative announced. "Emergency suspension. Effective now." Sterling tried to speak. No words came. His carefully constructed network, Mitchell's support, Rodriguez's supply contracts, the outside auditor's coach testimony, it all collapsed like a house built on sand meeting a tide. Mitchell was already taking Kowalski's calls. Rodriguez had taken a plea deal with federal prosecutors. The auditor's testimony was now suspect and would be disregarded. Sarah watched from the ICU corridor as Sterling was escorted out by federal agents. She didn't feel triumph. She felt the weight of 8 years lifting. She felt the weight of silence finally breaking. The colonel was awake when she checked his vitals an hour later. Fully alert. Clear eyes. His cardiac rhythm was sinus and stable on the monitor, a perfect rhythm that meant his heart was beating like it was supposed to beat, regular and strong and alive. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "I remember the voice. You kept talking to me in the Bird, telling me to stay awake. You said my daughter was a captain now. You said she was leading Rangers in Kandahar." His voice broke slightly. "I got your name tattooed so I'd find you. Swore I'd find you and thank you." Sarah's composure finally cracked. Just slightly. Just enough to let the truth out. "They told me you died in a second attack," she said quietly. "They gave me a folded flag too, sir. I carried your boots for 3 years because I had nothing else of you. Nothing else to hold on to." The colonel reached for her hand. His grip was still weak, but intentional. A handshake between soldiers. A recognition between people who'd paid the same price and survived. 6 months later, Sarah worked her night shift at Mercy General with a new title on her badge, Clinical Nurse Specialist, Trauma Services. Not invisible anymore. Not erased. Her nursing license had been restored and annotated with commendations from 3 branches of military service. The Navy Cross in her file made her permanently credentialed at a level that no administrator could ever touch. Captain Morrison stopped by the ICU most weeks, usually for coffee. The colonel visited even more often, no longer a patient, but a man who'd found the person he'd spent 8 years searching for. They didn't talk much about Helmand Province. They didn't need to. The understanding was there, written in the ease of silence between them. In the hospital's veteran memorial case, Sarah's combat boots were displayed. The leather was worn and creased from 8 years of walking between worlds. A small plaque beneath them read, "Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, United States Navy. Navy Cross." When her country needed her to disappear, she served in silence. When the call came, she answered. The medical supply fraud case exposed 12 other physicians who'd been buying inflated equipment through Rodriguez's company. Rodriguez received 18 months in federal prison. Sterling's permanent license revocation was approved unanimously by the state medical board. Someone spotted him 6 months after the sentencing, teaching CPR at Houston Community College for minimum wage, his hand still shaking as he demonstrated chest compressions to bored students who had no idea they were being instructed by a disgraced doctor, a man whose career had ended in federal court. Janes Park installed a new security system with triple redundancy and gave Sarah administrative access. "Just in case," he said with a slight smile. "In case someone ever tries to erase you again." In the ICU break room, a new nurse, fresh out of her BSN program, asked Sarah about the boots in the memorial case. Sarah touched the glass. The boots were still dusty from Helmand Province, still bearing the scuffs of that last patrol, still holding the memory of 17 men who came home alive. "Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns," Sarah said quietly. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The antiseptic smell mingled with fresh coffee. And Sarah Chen, no longer invisible, no longer erased, no longer pretending to be less than what she was, began another shift saving lives in the only way she knew how. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your value, if you've ever stayed silent when you should have spoken, or if you know someone carrying a secret that could change everything, please subscribe, like, and let us know in the comments. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes they're standing right next to you.